It started as two separate nightmares, two missing girls, 6 years apart in two quiet Alberta towns. No connection, no clues, just silence. For 30 years that silence haunted everyone, families, detectives, entire communities, until one day a single strand of DNA whispered what no one was ready to hear. These weren't two stories, they were one. The man everyone trusted, the mechanic who joined the search teams, the neighbor who brought coffee to grieving parents. He wasn't helping them heal, he was hiding what he'd done. This is the story of how time uncovered what people forgot. How guilt grew old but never died. And how two cold cases buried under decades of snow finally spoke. Because the truth doesn't stay buried forever. It waits for the right moment to awaken. Every vanishing leaves a sound only time can hear. A 17-year-old girl left a small diner one cold night in 1993. It was supposed to be an ordinary walk home. The waitress remembered her smile, the sound of the doorbell as she left, and the red scarf she wore against the wind. But after that, nothing. No screams, no calls for help, no car pulling away too fast. She simply vanished into the quiet streets of Alberta. At first, everyone thought she might have run away or gone to stay with a friend. Her mother stayed up all night, calling her name into the empty air, dialing her phone again and again even though she knew there would be no answer. Each ring became heavier, like a heartbeat slowing down. Days turned into weeks. Search teams came and went. Posters faded under rain and snow. The porch light stayed on every night. A small promise that if her daughter ever found her way home, she'd know the door was still open. But the light became more than hope. It became a sound, a rhythm, a quiet message repeating inside her mother's heart. Something's still out there. The town moved on, but her family couldn't. Her room stayed the same. Her clothes still folded. Her school books still waiting on the desk. Time didn't erase her. It just made her silence louder. Because silence is never truly empty. It remembers. It carries every question that was never answered, every step that was never retraced. And for those left behind, the disappearance never really ends. It only changes shape from a missing person to a memory that still breathes in the dark. The second disappearance wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. 6 years later, in the summer of 1999, it happened again. Another teenage girl disappeared, this time from a small town just an hour away. She was 15, full of life, and walking home from a friend's house after sunset. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where danger felt like something that only existed on the news. But that night, a familiar truck was seen parked near the old bus stop. Same make, same faded paint, same strange dent on the side. At first, people told themselves it couldn't be connected. Alberta was too big and the first case was too old. The police called it unrelated, saying there wasn't enough proof to draw a line between the two. But some of the older officers, the ones who still remembered the missing girl from 1993, felt a chill in their chest. It was the same feeling of déjà vu, the same quiet fear that history wasn't repeating, it was continuing. The girl's disappearance unfolded in the same painful rhythm, a late-night search party, posters on every light pole, the hum of helicopters circling above. Her family retraced her steps over and over, begging for clues that never came. And just like before, the trail ended where the silence began. The details were too similar to ignore. Both girls were young, kind, trusting. Both vanished without a sound. Both were last seen near a roadside where an old pickup had been spotted. And both cases, as fate would have it, would one day lead investigators to the same man. Evil doesn't always act out of impulse. It studies, it learns from its mistakes, it gets better at hiding. That's why this wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern, a carefully rehearsed repetition of cruelty that fed off a community's trust. What no one realized at the time was that the predator hadn't left. He was still there, walking the same streets, waving to the same people, pretending to care about the very girls he had stolen from them. The town thought lightning had struck twice, but the truth was darker. Lightning didn't strike again. It had never stopped. Evil doesn't always knock. Sometimes it offers you a ride. He wasn't a stranger lurking in the dark. He was someone everyone knew, the friendly mechanic from down the road, the man who helped fix tires for neighbors, who waved at kids biking past his shop. He smiled easily, spoke softly, and remembered everyone's name. In a small town like that, kindness was currency, and he spent it well. When the first girl went missing, he was among the first to show up to help with the search. He carried flashlights, handed out coffee, and comforted parents who could barely stand. People thanked him for his compassion, not realizing they were shaking hands with the very man who had caused their pain. 6 years later, when the second girl disappeared, he did it again, helping organize search teams, volunteering his truck to cover more ground. The same truck that had been seen parked near her last known location. That's how evil survives in daylight. It doesn't always hide in shadows or wear a mask. Sometimes it wears the face of familiarity. It knows how to blend in, how to appear useful, how to make people feel safe. The kind of evil that smiles back at you at the gas station. The kind that asks if you're okay when your car breaks down. He offered rides to stranded teens, claiming he didn't want them to walk alone in the dark. Parents trusted him because he'd been part of the community for years. He fixed cars, attended church, and showed up at school fundraisers. He had built a reputation of reliability, and behind that mask, he hid his true self. Predators like him don't always hunt with violence first. They hunt with trust. They study the rhythm of a town, learn its habits, and find comfort in its routines. And when they strike, they do it quietly, efficiently, with the confidence of someone who knows no one will ever suspect them. The horror of this case isn't just what he did, it's where he hid, in plain sight, among friends, among the very people praying for the victims he created. That's why evil is so dangerous when it learns to look kind. Because when it offers you a ride, you don't see a threat, you see a neighbor. And by the time you realize the difference, it's already too late. The dust of evidence never sleeps. For almost 3 decades, the files from both disappearances sat buried in the archives of 2 different police stations. Old boxes marked with fading handwriting, photographs yellowed by time, fibers, soil samples, and reports sealed in plastic bags that no one had opened in years. To most, those boxes were history, but to the families, they were the only proof that someone once cared enough to look. In 2023, a new generation of investigators began digitizing Alberta's cold cases, one file at a time. It was slow, careful work, scanning documents, labeling samples, and uploading evidence into new forensic databases. Among those re-examined files were the forgotten fragments from 1993 and 1999, 2 tragedies stored miles apart, yet carrying the same silent secret. A young forensic technician, barely old enough to remember the original disappearances, noticed something unusual while reviewing the old lab notes. A tiny fiber found near the first girl's belongings had the same chemical signature as one from the second case. Both had been logged years apart by different teams, both dismissed as non-significant. But technology had evolved. What once meant nothing now meant everything. When that fiber was retested using modern methods, it revealed a faint trace of DNA, a biological fingerprint invisible to the tools of the 90s. Suddenly, 2 dusty files from different towns became one story, and from that moment on, everything changed. Detectives reopened both cases, retracing every lead that had gone cold. Old witnesses were interviewed again. Family members who thought they'd never hear from the police again were suddenly called in. The hope that had been buried under years of disappointment began to rise again, fragile but alive. It turned out that evidence doesn't disappear, it only waits. It waits for better science, for sharper eyes, for someone new to care enough to look again. The dust that covered those files wasn't hiding failure, it was hiding truth, preserved by time, protected by patience. When the first match came through, one officer said quietly, "The case never died, it just slept." And that's what justice often does. It rests, it waits, it gathers strength in silence. Because even when years pass, and names fade from memory, the evidence, the real story, never sleeps. It just waits for the right hands to wake it. The past always signs its work. The truth didn't come from a confession or a sudden witness. It came from something smaller, something ordinary, a single fiber. It was found years ago on a torn piece of clothing from the first girl, and again on the backpack of the second. Back then, the tests were too weak to identify much. Investigators stored it away, labeling it as inconclusive, but time, as always, was still working quietly in the background. When the fiber was re-examined decades later, new forensic technology revealed something old science couldn't. The material came from a specific kind of truck seat cover, one that had been discontinued in the late 90s. It wasn't a common fabric. It belonged to a particular model of a 1992 pickup truck, the same model owned by the man who'd once offered to help with both searches. He had sold the truck months after the second girl vanished. He claimed it was for financial reasons, that he needed a newer one for work, but hidden inside that vehicle, Within its worn upholstery and carpet fibers, the past had already signed his name. Detectives tracked down the truck's last known owner, a farmer who'd bought it used years later. They found the old seat covers still intact, faded but familiar. When samples were taken, the results were undeniable. The same fiber that clung to both victims was traced straight back to that very vehicle. It was as if the truck itself had been keeping a secret, waiting for someone to listen. Even after it changed hands, after it crossed towns and years, the trace of his crimes followed it, silent, invisible but alive. The man thought he had erased his past when he sold that truck, washed the seats and walked away. But the past doesn't disappear when we throw it away. It lingers in the places we once touched, in the things we once used, in the air we once breathed. Evil always leaves a trail, even when it tries to hide. It can burn the photos, change the stories, bury the truth under years of lies. But somewhere, in some quiet corner of time, its signature remains. Guilt ages, but it never dies. It wasn't a confession out of fear, it was exhaustion. For 30 years, he had carried something too heavy to hide forever. He lived as if time could protect him, convincing himself that if enough years passed, guilt would fade like old paint on a wall. But guilt doesn't fade, it seeps. It moves quietly through a person's life, showing up in the lines of their face, in the way they avoid mirrors, in the sleepless hours no one else sees. Neighbors said he seemed too calm. Always polite, always composed, but calm isn't always peace. Sometimes it's guilt learning how to sit still. He never left Alberta, never changed his name, never ran, because in his mind he didn't need to. He thought the world had forgotten, but the past hadn't. He went to work every day, fixed cars, waved at children on bicycles, even joined search efforts for the very victims he created. But guilt has its own clock. It doesn't follow time, it follows conscience. And the longer it's ignored, the louder it grows. He could silence the police. He could silence the questions, but he couldn't silence his own reflection. Detectives later said that when they read him his rights, he didn't protest. He didn't deny anything. He just nodded slowly, eyes down, as if he'd been rehearsing that moment in his head for years. Guilt had already punished him long before justice did. Because guilt isn't a moment, it's a lifetime. It ages slower than a human face, feeding off every breath of denial. You can bury it under lies, build a family, change your routine, even laugh again. But guilt stays. It waits for quiet rooms, for sleepless nights, for the day when a knock on the door feels less like an arrest and more like relief. He thought time had protected him, but time wasn't protecting him. It was preparing him to face the truth he'd been running from without moving an inch. A mother sip's faith is its own forensics. For 30 years, she never stopped waiting. The world moved on, new houses were built, new families arrived. The posters faded, but her love refused to age. Every morning, she would walk to the edge of the porch and look down the same road her daughter had walked that last night. She told neighbors she just liked the sunrise, but everyone knew she was still watching, still hoping. She kept her daughter's room exactly the same, the blanket folded neatly on the bed, the hairbrush still on the dresser, the school jacket hanging by the door as if its owner might come running in any second. Every detail became sacred evidence to her, proof that her child once laughed, once dreamed, once lived. Every year on her daughter's birthday, she lit a single candle on the porch even through snowstorms. Some nights the wind blew it out, but she'd light it again. She said it was her way of calling her home. When people told her it was time to let go, she would smile softly and say, "A mother never lets go, she waits." There were times she felt crazy, talking to the air, whispering her daughter's name when no one else remembered. But deep inside she knew something the rest of the world didn't, that the truth had not disappeared, it had only been delayed. Her faith became her investigation. Her prayers became her reports. Her love became the link that science hadn't found yet. And when the call finally came, decades later, she didn't scream, she didn't faint. She just closed her eyes, took a deep breath and whispered, "I told you she never left me." Because some mothers don't need proof in a lab or files on a desk. They already know. Her heart had always known that her daughter's story wasn't over. And maybe, just maybe, it was that unbroken faith that kept the search alive, that made detectives reopen old boxes, that made a young analyst notice what others had missed. Because sometimes God hides justice inside a mother's patience. And in the end, it wasn't the machines or the DNA that brought the truth home. It was her faith that refused to die. Her love became the evidence time couldn't erase. Justice is slow because it walks, not runs. Justice didn't arrive in flashing lights or breaking headlines. It came slowly, quietly, step by step, carried by people who refused to give up even when everyone else already had. The cold case files had been opened and closed so many times that the paper edges had worn soft. But each time a new officer joined the force, someone would whisper, "You should read those Alberta cases. They still don't sit right." The years rolled by, and the investigation became like a relay race, one detective retiring, another picking up the same file, reading the same notes, hoping to see something everyone else had missed. Some days, it felt hopeless. Evidence was limited, leads were dead, and witnesses had long forgotten details. But real justice doesn't rush. It walks, steady, patient, unshaken. Forensic technology advanced inch by inch. What was once invisible started to speak. The fibers, the DNA traces, the fingerprints too faint to matter decades ago, all of it began to make sense. Scientists ran tests again, cross-referencing samples through new databases. What once took months could now be done in hours. Slowly, piece by piece, the puzzle began to form. But justice isn't just built in labs or offices. It's built in the hearts of those who refuse to look away. The mothers who never stopped asking questions. The journalists who kept mentioning their names every anniversary. The retired detective who visited his old desk once a year just to make sure the case files were still there. Every act of remembrance kept the case alive long enough for truth to catch up. When the match finally came, no one shouted. No one celebrated. It felt like time itself had taken a long, heavy breath and finally exhaled. It had been 30 years, 3 decades of waiting, praying, doubting, and enduring. Justice doesn't run because it doesn't need to. It knows the guilty can only hide for so long before time finds them. And when it finally arrives, it doesn't rush in anger. It walks in dignity. It comes when hearts are ready, when truth has matured, and when silence has no more room to hide. That's why it took years. Because justice doesn't break doors. It turns handles. It doesn't shout. It speaks softly, but with words that echo forever. The face of evil is often familiar. When his face finally appeared on the evening news, the entire community froze. People leaned closer to their televisions, blinking in disbelief. It couldn't be him. Not the quiet man from the auto shop. Not the one who fixed everyone's brakes and waved at kids walking home from school. He had been part of their daily lives, sitting in diners, laughing at local jokes, helping push cars out of snow. He was familiar, ordinary, trusted. That was what made it so terrifying. Neighbors remembered how he would drop by during the searches, offering help. He'd bring coffee to officers, pat grieving fathers on the back, and speak about how awful it was that such things could happen in a peaceful town. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was standing among them, sharing their pain that he had created. That's what makes evil so dangerous when it learns how to act human. It studies kindness. It mimics empathy. It knows what grief should look like and how to imitate concern. He attended local church events, donated tools to the high school garage class, and offered free car repairs to single mothers. Everyone saw him as a good man. Even when the police reopened the case, no one thought to suspect him. But beneath that calm exterior lived a secret that had aged with him. He had grown older, grayer, slower, but guilt doesn't retire. His silence wasn't innocence. It was fear disguised as routine. He learned that as long as he blended in, as long as he smiled, no one would ever look too closely. That's why the revelation shattered the community. It forced them to question their own instincts. The idea that evil must look like a monster, that it must hide in dark alleys or speak with a snarl. But real evil often wears the face of someone familiar. It shakes your hand. It helps your car start. It remembers your name. After his arrest, people began to replay every interaction they'd ever had with him. The way he stood too quietly during the vigils. The strange calm in his eyes when others cried. The way he always appeared just close enough to help, but never close enough to suspect. Those small details now carried a new weight. Clues that had been hiding in plain sight. Evil doesn't always announce itself. It adapts. It smiles. It learns to live next door, to walk the same streets, to share the same air. That's why when it's finally unmasked, it doesn't just shock a town, it breaks the very idea of safety. Because sometimes the scariest thing about monsters is how normal they look before you know who they really are. Truth doesn't need permission to return. When the truth finally began to rise, it didn't come with sirens or cameras. It came quietly, like dawn after a long winter night. For years, the families had stopped expecting phone calls. The detectives had stopped expecting breakthroughs. The files were old, the memories faded, the evidence fragile. But truth doesn't need permission to return. It doesn't wait for timing, or comfort, or readiness. It comes when it's meant to, and when it does, it changes everything. It started with one call from the lab, a DNA match, impossible to ignore. 2 cases, 6 years apart, now connected by one microscopic thread. Officers stared at the screen in silence. Some of them had worked those cases as young recruits. Now they were older with graying hair and tired eyes. But the moment they saw the results, they said it felt like time had folded, like the past had reached forward to finish what it started. News spread through the department, slowly at first. No one wanted to believe it, not until they saw the evidence themselves. The same truck fiber, the same DNA sequence, the same man who had been living freely among them all along. It was as if the truth had been buried alive and was finally clawing its way out of the dirt. When detectives went to arrest him, they said he looked almost relieved. Maybe because he knew the truth had finally caught up. Maybe because after all those years of pretending, he no longer had the strength to hide. The truth had walked straight through his walls without knocking. At the police station, the families were called in. They sat together in the same room for the first time. 2 mothers, 2 decades of pain. The lead investigator didn't say much. He didn't have to. The air itself felt heavy with everything that was finally known. One mother broke down, the other just whispered, "I knew it would come." Because truth doesn't die when people stop looking for it. It only waits for courage, for patience, for the right moment to speak. It moves in its own time, through the hands of strangers, and the hearts of believers. And when it arrives, it doesn't knock softly. It kicks down the door of every lie that tried to keep it out. That's how truth works. It doesn't ask to be remembered. It remembers you. The dead dawn set, rest until their names are spoken. When the judge began to speak, the words weren't about laws or technical details. They were about names. The names of the 2 girls who had vanished from Alberta all those years ago. Names that had been whispered in prayers, printed on posters, carved into candles, but never spoken in a courtroom until that day. As the judge read each one aloud, the sound echoed like thunder in a place that had known too much silence. Their names broke through the air, strong and clear, filling the space with the presence of 2 souls who had been missing for too long. The detectives who had worked the original cases stood in the back of the courtroom. Some of them were no longer in uniform, but they stood straight, eyes wet, knowing that the sound of those names meant their work had not been in vain. Justice had finally given voice to the silence that haunted them for decades. When the judge struck the final gavel, the families didn't stat cheer, they didn't stat clap. They simply closed their eyes, because justice doesn't stat always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like peace, a quiet, trembling peace that whispers, "You can rest now." The truth is, the dead don't rest until their names are spoken. They linger in the hearts of those who love them, in the empty spaces they once filled, in the dreams that visit their mothers at night. But the moment the world says their names with respect, with truth, and with justice, something changes. The air feels lighter. The silence feels softer. And in that Alberta courtroom, on that long-awaited day, it wasn't just a verdict that was delivered. It was a homecoming for 2 souls who had been lost in time and finally were heard. Time is the one detective that never clocks out. Time was the only detective that never gave up. It stayed on the case long after the police had retired, after the headlines had faded, after hope had turned into quiet acceptance. Time doesn't need a badge or a desk. It works in the spaces people forget. It listens. It remembers. It waits. Decades passed, and everything changed. The roads were rebuilt. The diner where one of the girls was last seen closed down. The fields where they searched grew over with new grass. But even as the world moved forward, time kept circling back to the same unanswered questions. It held on to every clue, every trace, every name. The first detective who worked the case in 1993 once said he had dreams about it. The same stretch of road, the same empty seat in the diner, the same unsolved ending. When he retired, he told the younger officers, "Someone will find it one day, maybe not us. But time has a way of finishing what we start." He was right. Because time doesn't forget what people do. It remembers what's buried. It keeps records in places we don't see. In the fibers of an old seat. In the DNA left behind. In the heart of a mother who refuses to stop believing. While the guilty man built his life, time quietly built a case against him. It watched, patient and calm, as technology caught up, as new hands picked up old files, as every missing piece finally found its place. When that DNA match appeared after 30 years, it wasn't a miracle. It was time keeping its promise. Every hour, every year, every person who refused to stop caring was part of its plan. Time doesn't clock out when the evidence gets cold. It just keeps working, unseen, unstoppable. And time also works on the hearts of those who wait. It softens grief just enough to keep them standing, but never enough to make them forget. It turns pain into persistence, tears into memory, memory into movement. That's how it delivers justice, not quickly, but completely. When the arrest was finally made, some called it coincidence, others called it luck, but it was neither. It was time doing what time always does, closing the circle, because truth doesn't rot with the years, and guilt doesn't expire. In the end, time becomes the only detective that never clocks out, never takes a day off, and never loses the file. It just waits for the right moment to step forward and whisper, "Now." The day the verdict was read, Alberta stood still. Decades of silence finally broke, not with applause, but with a long, trembling breath. For years, the community had lived with questions that had no answers, prayers that seemed to vanish into the cold air. But now, the truth stood in front of them, quiet, undeniable, complete. Outside the courthouse, the sky was gray, the kind of gray that feels heavy but cleansing. Families held framed photos close to their hearts. Reporters whispered updates, but even they spoke softer that day, as if the story itself deserved reverence. It wasn't victory. It wasn't triumph. It was something deeper, closure wrapped in sorrow. The mothers of the two girls stood side by side, strangers once connected only by grief, now united by truth. One of them placed her hand on the other's shoulder and said softly, "They can rest now." That moment said more than any headline ever could. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it weeps. Sometimes it looks like two candles burning side by side in the wind, refusing to go out. The case was over, but the story would live on. A warning, a prayer, a reminder that even the coldest silences still have voices waiting to be heard. And as the courthouse lights dimmed that night, a reporter wrote the final words of her article. After 30 years, Alberta learned that time may bury the truth, but it never kills it. The snow melts, the earth remembers, and even in the quietest corners, the silent cases awaken. Because no crime stays buried forever. No secret stays hidden beneath the weight of years. And no soul, no matter how long forgotten, remains unheard when truth finally comes home.